So when Marta Buchholz first contacted me about this conference title being the Fantasy Reality Continuum, I immediately thought of one of the central but seldom explained and examined fantasies, that of Europe as a single unit or singular unit of analysis, often even considered unique in its exemplary character, and as the basis or even as the norm of a comparison. So whether this norm of Europe is used as the norm of a comparison, it's understood as a civilization, as a location of modernity, or as an ideal political, economic, or cultural standard to attain, this is one of the most used fantasies at the midst or in the midst of sociological theory production. So before I go through the main concepts in the main title, Occidentalism and Imperial Maps, I want to dwell a little bit on the Europe that is what I suggest to place on a continuum. And this would be a bit in opposition, so placing on a continuum, in opposition to placing at the pinnacle of some way of linear development. So what is Europe in theory? And this is a bit of play on words, because Europe in theory is not only the title of a great book by Roberto Dainotto called Europe in Theory with parentheses, whose cover foregrounds not only the importance of Christianity by placing, I don't know if you can tell very well, a Christ figure, a white and whitewashed Christ figure in the middle of the cover that is being looked upon by, if we know the book, we know, elderly Italian ladies commenting on the centrality of the Christ figure, but in a way kind of underlining the fact that this is a very Christian and we know very Catholic place from which the book speaks. What Dainotto wants to do is basically to speak from the south of Europe, and this is why he chooses this image. But I take this just as a cue because the title is, I think, very cleverly chosen. But Europe in theory is also part of the legacy of social theory, which has long operated with what I call a sublimated and sanitized version of European history. And okay, what do I mean by sanitized exactly? To put it very briefly, the Europe, and mostly it's Europe writ large, that is constituting the subject matter as well as the subject position of most sociological theory, increasingly ignored both the experience of the East and the South of Europe in its accounts of Europe's trajectory towards either modernity, nation-state formation, and citizenship rights. This is why Dainotto wants to rethink Europe from the perspective of the so-called pigs countries, right? The derogatorily called pigs countries, the kind of opposite of the solid and reliable bricks. So basically, this Europe writ large, the prevailing version of European history, largely disregarded the experience and the history of the East and the South as a subject of sociological theory, and also the colonial and imperial history in order to elide processes linked to non-European events and non-Western European locations from accounts of capitalist modernity, from the particular historical circumstances of the European colonial expansion in the Americas through colonial and imperial conquest of the non-European world, and up to the impact of enslaved plantation labor on economies of Western societies and on what was called then industrial development. Now, this is not something necessarily new. A lot of historians, for instance, have called attention to the partial character of the notion of Europe. And in particular, Bulgarian historian Maria Todorova has explained how Europe functions as what she calls an unmarked category. She's done so in a number of publications, but also in this special issue of Southeastern Europe. And I like the way it is graphically fragmented there, Balkan identities, nation, and memory. At the same time, speaking not from Europe or about one of Europe's, but from outside. Dipesh Chakrabarty has, in a well-known book, Provincializing Europe, pointed to how a hyper-real Europe becomes the theoretical subject of all histories, making it necessary then to provincialize Europe in order to write adequate history. And again, others, such as Larry Wolff, have reconstructed the invention of other Europes, in particular Eastern Europe as an other within. I'm not going to repeat their arguments here or dwell on them. They are very important and they've been out there for a while. Instead, what I want to do is to paraphrase Martinican writer Edouard Glissant, who first drew attention to the fact that the West is not in the West. It is a project, not a place. And in saying that, he was pointing to, and I will extend his argument to also mean, that the same goes for Europe. Not only is Europe a project rather than a place, it has been a long-term project. That means it is a work in progress. And its current result also represents at least one problem. For me, this is a way to contest the definition power of sanitized and ahistorical sociological categories, in that we productively complicate the notion of Europe, not complicate it for the complication's sake, but in order to place its various avatars, if you want, on a continuum between fantasy and reality. And the first step in complicating the notion of Europe would be here to distinguish between Eurocentrism and Occidentalism, which tend to be conflated, but are not synonymous. And here I'm coming to the first concept in the title, Occidentalist fantasies. As conceptualized by Fernando Coronil and then developed further by Walter Mignolo, the term Occidentalism is not a synonym of Eurocentrism, but one that points to how the self-image of the West emerged not as a discourse about all of Europe, but as a discourse about and from the West. So as a pan-Western discourse that constructed and downgraded both European and non-European others to the extent that what had been constructed as their Occidentality or their Westernness had become questionable in a given historical and geopolitical context. And there were many such contexts. I'm going to illustrate a few. But just to give Coronil's definition, Coronil discusses Occidentalism as the expression of a constitutive relationship between Western representations of cultural difference and worldwide Western dominance. And Mignolo makes it clear that this doesn't mean that Occidentalism is the mirror image, the counterpart of Orientalism. On the contrary, it is its precondition. Only on the basis of an already formed image of the West that understands itself as superior and as kind of triumphant in an already kind of Western-dominated world, is it possible to devise an image of the other onto which to project the Orient. So Occidentalism is then, although I admit, more cumbersome term than Eurocentrism, one that actually does more justice to the way a discourse from and about the West set the stages for discourses about the West's others, but that included the West's others within Europe, and that included discourses from other parts of the global North, such as the US, about others, so that we could hardly speak about the US's Eurocentrism, right? That doesn't make any sense, but US's Occidentalism does. So seeing how an image of the Occident as the grounding of the European history concept at the core of sociological theory impacts this sociological theory, we can see how these epistemological premises of the Western European context systematically produced a sanitized version of modern Europe, from which not only colonial violence, genocide, and plunder were mostly missing. Not everyone is guilty of that. And Elias does very much point to the violence Obviously, that's why we're here, because we kind of value his work. But it's not true for most of sociological theory that violence, colonial violence, and genocide were seen as part of the modernity that emerges. Also, the millions of people that had been forcibly exploited or moved across continents for several centuries to the benefit of Western European institutions like the Catholic Church, or of corporations such as the British or the Dutch East India or West India Company, or all of the European states vying for territorial control overseas. All of this is mostly missing from the sociology that I've been taught. Looking forward to hearing about contrasting experience, if there are any. Equally missing then from this prevailing notion of Europe was the voluntary emigration of up to 50 million Europeans to the Americas between the 1840s and the 1930s. Here's a map from a Phillips Atlas of World History from 2004, illustrated and kind of starting with the idea that as the wider world became known to Europeans, many of them left their native countries in search of a better life for themselves and their families. A very simplistic explanation, but a very comprehensive image of the kind of movement out of Europe that we're looking at in not only the 19th century, which was the peak, the pinnacle of the out-migration of Europeans to the colonies, but of 32 million Europeans from the 17th century to the beginning of the 20th. Something that is not part of a historical sociology of migration that speaks about the migration of Europeans, but that actually only emerges once migration flows start impacting Europe and start kind of reversing the migration trend and the migration direction of most of these flows for most of the history of the West, basically, which were migration mostly unhindered, mostly without forms of contemporary passport control or border control, into what was considered terra nullius, which was considered no man's land, right? Or there were even incentives to go there. Now, this number of 32 million Europeans moving to the Americas in between the 17th and the 20th, the beginning of the 20th century, seems to dwarf the other figure that is right below, both geographically and in terms of numbers, the 12.5 we know million Africans kidnapped from Africa and trafficked into the trade in enslaved people to the Americas. Also part of a bigger picture of what migration has meant if we want to conceptualize this form of trade in enslaved people as a very general way of saying this is also some labor migration. As part of the history of Europe, of the emergence of capitalism and of modernity. So basically, at the very moment that Marx and Engels, extrapolating from the British context in 1848, identified class struggle as the primary conflict of European modern bourgeois society and its outcome as proletarianization, immigration to Europe's colonies in the Americas started providing a poverty outlet to 12% of the continent's population and to no less than 50% of Britons. So what would that class struggle have been like if that outlet had not been provided, if it had not been there? But also, where are the concepts that echo the fact that something else was happening besides the internal class struggle, besides proletarianization, besides class conflict? So by the 1950s, large-scale immigration and the lowering of ethnic heterogeneity in Europe through nation building, expulsions, and waves of ethnic cleansing gradually ensured that processes of collective organization and social stratification were theorized in terms of class interests and class conflict rather than ethnic or racial allegiance. And this is a way of writing race and ethnicity gradually out of Europe, be it maybe as exceptions that are allowed, but not as constitutive. against overwhelming evidence to the contrary, then, Europe was increasingly produced as a coherent entity. Sociology and political science books presented the emergence of sovereign nation states in Europe following the 1640 Treaty of Westphalia as marking the gradual overcoming of multinational political organizations and multi-ethnic empires, and the start of processes of ethnic homogenization within Europe, or most of Europe. In turn, then, the transnational flows of people, goods, and capital appeared as a relatively new trend of the late 20th century, and the growing influx of immigrants into Europe as an unprecedented effect of equally recent transnational processes on a once homogeneous European context. So this on the question of what do fantasies do to preclude or to prevent an adequate understanding of the present. If we look at the kind of blind spots produced by such Occidentalist social theory, it means that if we must understand such theory as an Occidentalist one that has disregarded large-scale systematic cross-border processes preceding the emergence of Western nation states, because a lot of what is being described here cannot be adequately conceptualized as transnational migration, because it was happening before there were nation states anywhere in Europe, in Africa, in the Americas. So we have some other form of transregional, transcontinental, transcolonial even migration, but not transnational until very late. Also, a kind of theory that disregards the transnational and transregional experiences of those increasingly racialized as non-European or non-Western or non-white or all of the above, and one that disregards the multiple entanglements between Europe and its colonies, dependencies, and occupied territories throughout the centuries. Now, that is already encapsulated in the critique of a sanitized notion of Europe, in which then there's a misrepresentation or a downgrading or a downplaying or an outright neglect of the dynamics of colonialism and imperialism, which leads us to what I call the twin fallacies of Occidentalism and social theory. First, overgeneralization, kind of the historical indebtedness of core categories of the sociology of inequality that starts with class conflict, proletarianization, and social mobility that are made more visible through such neglect and downplaying than processes such as colonialism, the trade in enslaved people, and the European emigration to the Americas. So we have a disproportionate representation there. And the second fallacy, downright erasure, the erasing the massive dislocation of people triggered by the European colonial expansion into the Americas from several continents, not just from Europe to the Americas, but from Africa to the Americas, then the genocide in the Americas, and several processes of enslavement. The impact of subsequent migration processes on all of these parts of the world, then also the reorganization of colonial economies, but also metropolitan economies in relation to the plantation economy. Now, if we disregard the massive processes linked to these, the sanitization of European history and European representation, then we neglect the fact that the global division of labor had gradually reorganized also political systems as well. And we see a tendency of relegating the colonial societies to a past that Western societies had allegedly overcome. So if there's unfree labor, if there's racial and ethnic conflict, and if there is anything not resembling industrialized Western societies, they are not seen as other on a same plane, but on along the lines that Johannes Fabian has called the denial of co-evilness. They are placed in the past of Western societies. Okay, you might or might not agree up to this point. You're probably still wondering, so where's the imperial maps? I promise there will be maps, but getting to them requires a bit of a personal geolocation. As a Romanian scholar living in Germany, I have long been thinking from the border between Western Europe and one of its other Europes, the one that at different moments in its history has been defined as Eastern Europe and is often still reduced to being an other within. And we're in one of these Europes now, in this Eastern Europe. I grew up in Romania in a white middle-class family in the last decade of Nicolae Ceausescu's regime. I got a philology degree in Bucharest and then moved to Germany to study sociology for what I thought would be an MA degree, but turned out to be a doctorate. But this is where my initially abstract interest in social difference and inequality became lived experience. Because growing up in downtown Bucharest, I had been raised to consider myself European. And I also grew up with the privilege of not having to consider whether or not I was white. But moving to Germany some 25 years ago, shortly before what was then called the Eastern European enlargement of the European Union, I witnessed the definition of Europe being gradually narrowed down to membership of the European Union, and the understanding of Europeanness being gradually narrowed down to European Union citizenship. And I didn't have those. So all of a sudden, it wasn't clear whether or not I was exactly European or was on my way to becoming European. And it was, depending on the context, no longer clear whether or not I was exactly white. So several moments and anecdotes that I'm sure each of us with this kind of background can share testify to these kinds of experiences. But as a sociologist, I was also looking for visual material. The maps are coming. And the European Commission was providing some in order to illustrate what was going on with the Eastern European enlargement. And one of the maps that I used a lot since then, and it's still out there, you can check it out and use it, great resolution, maybe not on this projector, is one from 2004, so shortly before the 10 Eastern European countries that joined the European Union that year had actually legally accessed. And the map kind of color-coded Europeanness, if you want, by reducing it to European Union membership and saying that yellow are the member states up to 2004, blue are the ones that are going to join in 2004, and you probably can't really tell the difference, but Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey are purple, not blue. And the connotation of purple was that these are the next in line. Romania and Bulgaria were also supposed to join 2004, but they were then postponed until 2007. At that moment, it was still, that was the order that Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey will be next. As we know, this never happened, but at least the European Commission, being a very diligent institution, immediately produced an updated map upon accession. So it got a bit simplified. There was only kind of the EU, now 25 in all yellow. And then those that will join at some point were now in some dark gray. Romania and Bulgaria were dark gray. Croatia had come to candidacy, so it was now a candidate for membership. It's not clear whether the shades of gray, pardon the pun, of Turkey meant anything, or whether the only connotation was that you didn't want to be some kind of light gray, but the darker the better. But actually what everybody wanted to be was yellow. Now, for a long time, I thought, this is my critical edge. I'm looking at Europe and at the fantasies that the process of adhering to the European Union is producing from the eastern border. I know that I can ask different questions because of my experience of having grown up in the east of Europe and having kind of witnessed this process of Eastern European Union accession as it unfolded. And at some point I realized that I was myself kind of ignoring, very blatantly ignoring something else on the map that was on both maps, and I was still ignoring it. That rectangle up there were also some territories belonging to the European Union, had been depicted in yellow from the very beginning, but were never part of the discourse of what it means to be European, of what it means to belong to Europe, or what it means to be part of European civilization. These are probably very hard to make out. The Azores, Madeira, Guadeloupe, Martinique, the Canary Islands, and French Guiana. The only one that you see maybe at all clearly is French Guiana, because it's just big enough. But any official map of the European Union would have to depict those. If we discuss this, and when I do discuss this and EU officials are present, they're like, well, so what? You didn't know that? You, as sociologists, you don't talk about it? We know that, of course, they are part of Europe. The problem is not so much whether or not they are juridically part of Europe, but are they part of how Europe narrates itself? And is the fact that French Guiana is in South America ever part of negotiations of having only European states join the European Union, as negotiations were kind of undertaken with Morocco on these terms, not European, with Turkey, half European. There's more grounds for denying other states membership, but Europeanness is very much one of them. Not if you're French Guiana or the Canary Islands. Why? Because of a colonial link. You do not deny the belongingness and kind of the Europeanness of territories that have been European for centuries, right? So this is why they're depicted in yellow, but also it doesn't matter. So how does Europe narrate itself? This is part of my understanding of how we translate from mental maps of self and other, which, as we know, everyone has, and as Elias has showed, can become established versus outsiders, or can become something else depending on the relations of power. But how do we translate such mental maps into imperial maps? I would say that the representation of Europe's current colonial territories, because this is what they are, in both of these maps, tells us something about how imperial maps come about. And this is something that Fernando Coronil has theorized as Occidental imperial maps, ones that linked to the definition power that emanates from a specific location, also linked to a project of territorial expansion, either a past, present, or kind of ongoing one. And a truth claim makes a mental map of this is Europe and can belong to Europe now, or is unquestionably so, a kind of imperial map that promotes and continues to reproduce that imperial project. This is something that Aníbal Quijano has talked about with the term of coloniality of power, by which Quijano, Peruvian sociologist, has described the political, economic, and sociocultural hierarchies between colonizers and colonized emerged symbolically, but also kind of gradually from 1492 onwards, so with the colonization of the Americas. And his conceptualization of coloniality is that it is modernity's dark side. It's coloniality, not colonialism, because it does start with administrative colonialism, with the conquest, basically. But once administrative colonialism is over, so once territories become independent, coloniality, the hierarchies, racial, cultural, epistemic, political, and economic hierarchies, remain in place or are still being reproduced. So this is how coloniality is more enduring than colonialism and more encompassing than it, because it transfers racial ethnic hierarchies emerged during colonial rule into post-independent times. And I use that understanding to look at how the definition of different Europes has led to imperial maps of what I call multiple and unequal Europes. Basically, by not having one Europe that diffuses around the world and propagates different alternative, multiple, or entangled modernities, but having several Europe with different and very unequal roles in shaping what modernity even means because of its colonial darker side. So basically around the 18th century, we have ascending powers, primarily France and England, gradually only England, claiming the definition power of their modernity, development, and industrialization as European achievements rather than regional or national achievements. And I term that heroic Europe, which is a discourse about oneself, but also one that allots power, different and equal power of definition to others that it links to its own self-understanding. Basically, France and England ascending to power around the 18th century and claiming the achievements of modernity for themselves would mean that the Iberian colonizers that had declined from that same power, but at the same time had declined from the definition power of claiming what it meant to have achieved Europeanness or have achieved something in the name of Europeanness or Christianity, became decadent in the sense of decline from power. In world systemic terms, we have an economic core ascending to which later Germany would join, but that's why Germany is not a prototype of that kind of discourse, because for a long time it was the late industrializer that was talking more about its own special way, its Sonderweg, and it was joining late, but join it did. And in that classification, there is a kind of epigonal status from the Greek epigon, the kind of unworthy follower, the one that just imitates, the one that tries to catch up, but was never part of what made modernity what it is. The East of Europe, primarily kind of represented, especially in the literature, and there's a lot of work on that. The Balkans, kind of as the powder keg of Europe that creates conflict, the one that tries to catch up in terms of economic development, but one that was not, but in Huntington's terms, lightly touched by the industrial developments or by the Enlightenment, is one that just catches up insofar the epigonal Europe. And then finally, I included the category of forgotten Europes with the prototype, the British Virgin Islands, not out of a whim, but because they are the oldest colonies of Britain and in the Caribbean. So basically for uninterrupted 400 years now. And I call that forgotten Europes, not because I was forgetting these Europes, because I was for a very long time. But obviously, people living in these territories very much know that their territories are claimed by Europe, and there are economic and political and even administrative links to Europe. So they do not forget it. What I meant with forgotten Europes is a way in which the narrative on Europe and the fantasy of belonging to Europe actively forgets them in the discourse by never mentioning those territories unless there's a crisis. We hear about French Guiana, we hear about the British Virgin Islands, we hear about Guadeloupe and Martinique when there's a hurricane, an earthquake, or when there's elections in France and everyone needs to also campaign in the Caribbean because they are important departments, and if it's a close election, then the population there counts as well. So I discussed this as form of coloniality of memory. We discuss these territories, we know they're there. Officially, they actually cannot be missing from maps of Europe, but there's a systematic omission of the enduring colonial ties from public discourse on Europe. And there's a very careful avoidance of classifying such territories today as regions of Europe. What we hear is that these are places in the Dutch Caribbean. They were not represented on the European Union map because they're tiny, but they're there. We hear about the British West Indies. We hear about the French Antilles, but the reference is always to the nation state that claims them, never to Europe. They're not Europe's, they're this state's business somehow. There's a lot of business like that. It seems like we're talking about a small part of the world with a small population, and this is normally how a lot of the literature has treated forgotten Europes. There's even an author whose name I forgot, I'm sorry, that talks about confetti of empire, but I do not agree, so I would not pass that reference on anyway. The way, at least, the distribution, oh, that's also not easily legible. The distribution of forgotten European Union territories looked like in 2020. That was before Brexit, and that is important because Britain has 14 of those, and there's 29 all in all. So once Brexit happened, these territories are still obviously part of Britain in different ways, not part of Britain, not integral parts. There's different juridical statuses, but they are Britain's business, so to say, but no longer of the European Union. So there's you should be seeing something blue that are the 28 EU member states, so including UK, and then some blue stars, the Azores, Madeira, Canary Islands, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guyana. These are integral parts of European Union states. Their citizens have European Union citizenships. They are also represented on Euro banknotes on each and every one of them, but that's not something that is pointed out either. And even when only those that are big enough are depicted, at least the European Central Bank is careful enough to point to the others as well and zooms in. And that's from the website of the European Central Bank, where it carefully kind of points out to the others as well. Okay, here we are. If these territories are seen as part of Europe and are how Europe constitutes itself juridically, administratively today, then part of the discourse that we're hearing about what Europe is and what its relationship with the European Union is very partial, very distorted, and very much harking back to the colonial and imperial discourse that has been missing so far. So this is the present day mirror of it. But it is not just, I mean, we're talking about continuities, right? A continuum is not a continuity, it's not just linear, right? Jason said. Well, there's an in-between episode, at least, or several. Part of how Europe narrated itself for a long time was through incorporating colonies into its own self-definition. Now, the scramble for Africa is long before there's any common European project. But this is how Africa looked in 1880. And as we know, Bismarck convened the Congo Conference in Berlin in 1884, 1885 to carve up Africa. And this is how gradually after that conference, Africa then looked like by 1914, with basically a piece of the pie for every colonial power that had wanted to claim one. The result, we can say, well, this is really not connected to the way reality looks like today. If we look at the few territories that are still or can still be considered colonial territories today, this is nothing compared to that picture, right? But this is not for lack of trying. Let me skip over here. Sorry. I should be able to see all the slides, but I can't. So, okay, I'm just gonna show you the fantasy of Eurafrica, in the words of Leopold Senghor. Eurafrica was part of a project that before the European Union came into being and before the European community came into being, was the imaginary of how Europe would look like, namely that it would include all African colonies of France primarily, but all African colonies of European states of the first 6 EU members. This was something into which African intellectuals and politicians were also co-opted in the belief that having Eurafrica as a common project is the way to both overcome the cleavages and the conflicts of the past, so basically the wounds of colonialism, but also kind of building a common future. Senghor himself thought that this is a way of emancipating the peoples of the overseas territories. There are other imaginaries, starting from Konrad Adenauer, who said this is a way of developing the Ruhr region. We're going to get all the labor from Africa and use Africa as a market for European products. But also French politicians thinking this is a way of appeasing the Germans, and there will finally never be war again between France and Germany because we will have common interests. What this project and this one Occidentalist fantasy did not reckon with was the rapid decolonization of Africa in the 50s and 60s, so that by the time France had lost Algeria, that prospect was no longer viable. Nevertheless, this is a fragmented continuum, but a continuum of images and self-images of Europe projected onto the rest of the world that I think are just as much part of how Europe should narrate itself as they are part of how we should be looking at Europe if we want to see both the dark side and the sunny side, both modernity and coloniality, and both its underside and the one that has been shining through. I leave it at that and hope that there will be a discussion. Thank you.